long before the notorious War of 1982, the Falkland Islands of the South Atlantic played witness to another famous battle, this time during World War I, when factions of the Imperial German Navy and the Royal Navy went head-to-head in the frigid, turbulent waters of this vast ocean, leading to one of the deadliest naval confrontations of the entire conflict. The prelude to the Battle of the Falklands begins with the destruction of a cruiser squadron under the command of Admiral Christopher Cradock at the Battle of Coronel on November 1, 1914, during which the British fleet, which engaged the East Asiatic Squadron of the Imperial German Navy off the west coast of Chile in the Pacific, was obliterated in a decidedly one-sided confrontation that saw only 3 German sailors wounded to the loss of HMS Good Hope and HMS Monmouth, resulting in the deaths of 1,660 Royal Naval personnel, together with Admiral Cradock himself. The German attack force comprising the armoured cruisers SMS Scharnhorst and SMS Gneisenau, and the light cruisers SMS Dresden, Leipzig and Nuremberg, all under the command of the famous Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee. Initially, it was not believed that the German forces had successfully routed the British due to the supposed presence of HMS Canopus, a pre-dreadnought battleship that would have given the Royal Navy a major tactical advantage over the German squadron, though due to her huge size and underpowered engines, she was unable to keep up with Cradock's lightweight cruisers and thus arrived too late to partake in the battle, the Admiralty in London only appreciating the loss of Cradock's attack squadron when reports came in from the Canopus, together with the only survivors of the battle, the light cruiser HMS Glasgow and the armed merchantman HMS Otranto, that they were withdrawing back to the Falkland Islands, thus leaving no obstacle to von Spee escaping into the South Atlantic, where he could disrupt any of the important Allied operations around the African coast. In response, Admiral Archibald Stoddart, who was en route to the Pacific from the Mediterranean to support Cradock, was ordered to concentrate his armoured cruisers HMS Carnarvon and Cornwall, together with the armoured cruiser HMS Defence, at the Uruguayan capital of Montevideo at the mouth of the River Plate, while the survivors of the Battle of Coronel, HMS Canopus, Glasgow and Otranto, would join formation with Stoddart's attack squadron alongside armoured cruiser HMS Kent that was sent with all possible dispatch from the East Atlantic, the expectation being that, with the Falkland Islands now defenceless, von Spee would seek to try and capture the British colony and use it as a base for his own raiding parties against Allied shipping in the South Atlantic. Admiral Jellicoe, commanding the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow, also ordering the battle cruisers HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible from his 2nd Battle Cruiser Squadron for service in the South Atlantic to provide additional defence against von Spee's naval force, picking up the cruiser HMS Bristol and the auxiliary cruiser HMS Macedonia along the way to strengthen the light cruiser element of his squadron. Admiral von Spee's squadron, meanwhile, comprised ships stationed in the Pacific for a number of years before the outbreak of World War I, with their crews comprised almost entirely of regular German naval personnel, Spee's 2 armoured cruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, being particularly efficient ships, with each having won shooting awards several times, though this was countered by the fact that all of his vessels had been at sea for several months under active service conditions and were therefore in need of a refit, the first move after the Battle of Coronel being to send his force to the Chilean port of Valparaiso for a brief respite, being permitted 24 hours to stay in a neutral port before weighing anchor and sailing for the island of Mazafuera, 500 miles to the west, the designated rendezvous point for the rest of his squadron. Attempting to predict von Spee's strategy, the Admiralty suggested correctly that his attack squadron would make for Mazafuera in order to regroup, rather than heading for the South Atlantic, thus allowing the British Defence Fleet the ability to gather enough force to combat the Germans off the coast of Uruguay, the potential existing that Admiral of the Fleet Sir Frederick Charles Doveton Sturdee, who had arrived in the area aboard HMS Invincible and thus assumed full command over Admiral Stoddart, may have to pursue von Spee into the Pacific, while HMS Canopus was ordered to Port Stanley in the Falklands so as to defend the harbour. Von Spee, upon reaching Mazafuera, joining up with light cruiser SMS Leipzig, alongside the colliers Amasis and Santa Isabel, together with another captured ship, the SMS Baden arriving the next day with another captured collier that von Spee immediately appropriated for his warships, cruisers Prince Eitel Friedrich and SMS Dresden joining on November 8th, also with intercepted colliers taken as prizes to support the wider German attack squadron. Taking on coal from the captured vessels, von Spee's fleet remained at Mazafuera until November 15th, his delayed departure being predicated on German reports that the battle cruisers SMS Seydlitz, Moltke and von der Tann were attempting to stage a breakout from the Royal Navy blockades in the North Sea so as to adjoin his attack squadron in the South Atlantic, though ultimately this did not happen. von Spee setting course for the Straits of Magellan at the southern tip of South America, arriving on November 21st at St. Quentin Bay on the Chilean coast some 500 miles short of Cape Horn, where he met 3 large German ships carrying coal and provisions, one of these ships, the Luxor, having broken its internment at Coronel by evading Chilean authorities. The reports of its escape and subsequent tracking through Chilean waters reaching the Admiralty, which confirmed that von Spee was preparing to round Cape Horn and enter the South Atlantic. Sturdee, now with a formidable fighting force of ships, ordering his squadron to steam south in order to intercept von Spee in the South Pacific, rather than waiting for him to enter the Atlantic, as per the information being provided by the Admiralty. On December 7th, the British attack group arrived at Port Stanley to replenish its coal supplies prior to continuing its advance south in order to pursue von Spee into the Pacific, unaware that on the night of December 1st, the German attack squadron had rounded Cape Horn and captured the British collier Drum Muir, which was en route to San Francisco. Von Spee taking the Drum Muir to Picton Island at the eastern end of Beagle Channel and using it to replenish his coal supplies over the course of the next 3 days, sinking the cargo ship once finished and continuing his journey to the Falklands on December 6th. The German fleet, as informed by a passing Dutch ship, being warned that a British defence squadron was coaling in Port Stanley, with von Spee calculating that the British fleet must comprise the battleships Canopus and Carnarvon, possibly being supported also by the Defence, Cornwall and Glasgow. The German Admiral, despite knowing full well that HMS Canopus and its 12-inch guns could easily outrange his light cruisers, developing a new plan of action that would see him lure the British ships out into the open sea before destroying them, rather than bombarding the harbour at Port Stanley, which included coaling facilities vital for his ships to maintain a successful raiding campaign in the South Atlantic. Finally, on December 8, 1914, the observation tower on HMS Canopus spotted 2 unidentified warships approaching Port Stanley from the south at 7:50 a.m., these 2 ships being Gneisenau and Nuremberg, which had been sent ahead of the main East Asiatic squadron to reconnoitre the British strength and to destroy the radio station with gunfire so that no warning could be passed on of their approach, this move catching the British completely by surprise as the fleet was still coaling in the harbour, and through so many conflicting reports of the German positions, were not expecting to weigh anchor until that evening at the earliest, HMS Glasgow ultimately being the one to raise the alarm, though it would not be for another 20 minutes before the ships in Port Stanley were ordered to stand to, this lack of urgency only being countered by the fact that Admiral Sturdee had prepared for the potential approach of the German fleet by ordering that his ships be ready to sail at 2 hours' notice, rather than shutting down their boilers for repairs and maintenance work. At 8:30, Sturdee's squadron was ready to get underway, although HMS Bristol, still undergoing repairs, could not join the attack squadron until 11 a.m. at the earliest, while HMS Macedonia, which was out on patrol, was ordered back into harbour, as it had not the weaponry to successfully engage the enemy in the open sea. The appearance of Gneisenau and Nuremberg being followed shortly thereafter by the spotting of smoke on the horizon that heralded the arrival of the remainder of von Spee's elusive East Asiatic squadron, HMS Canopus firing the first shot at 9 a.m., using its long-range 12-inch guns to drive away the Gneisenau and the Nuremberg as they attempted to destroy the radio station near Hooker Point, the German vessels hoisting their ensigns and turning away to the southeast quickly, putting themselves out of range, the reconnoitre mission identifying a substantial British presence in the harbour at Port Stanley, and thus, in the face of such overwhelming enemy strength, the 2 German ships turned and made off at high speeds towards the Scharnhorst and the rest of the squadron. At 10 a.m., the British fleet weighed anchor and set out at full steam in pursuit of the German attack squadron, with Inflexible leading Invincible and Cornwall, while Glasgow and Kent followed the German ships at a distance in order to keep track of their position. The clearing weather and improved visibility, allowing the British to easily spot the rising smoke of von Spee's 5 warships 15 miles to the southeast. Glasgow, which led the charge, giving continued updates as to the German positions, due to the copious amounts of black coal smoke from the larger battlecruisers obscuring their view of the enemy fleet, the lack of maintenance and refits on the German ships, meaning they were only capable of achieving a measly 15-knot top speed, impossible to outrun the 28-knot pace of Admiral Sturdee's squadron, thus meaning, by 11:30 a.m., von Spee's East Asiatic squadron was almost within range, while back at Port Stanley, as HMS Bristol finally weighed anchor, locals on the Falklands reported sighting 3 further ships on the horizon, which turned out to be von Spee's hospital ship and colliers, Bristol subsequently being ordered to intercept and destroy the intruders. At 12:20 p.m., von Spee ordered his close formation of 5 warships to break up, turning to the southeast and using their own smoke to cover their escape, Sterde ordering his squadron to immediately engage, with the SMS Leipzig, the slowest of the German vessels and now within 16,000 yards or 9 miles of the British, being fired upon first by HMS Inflexible, followed immediately by HMS Invincible. Though initially, none of these shots were able to land a hit. Von Spee, seeing that there was no chance for his light cruisers to either outrun or outgun the advancing British forces, ordering at 1:20 p.m. for his ships to scatter and make their way individually to the South American coast, where they would continue their role as raiders against Allied commercial shipping, while Scharnhorst and Gneisenau turned into line ahead to the northeast to give battle to the British squadron and buy time for the other vessels of his fleet, the light cruisers Dresden, Nuremberg and Leipzig, immediately turning to starboard and escaping to the south, while Invincible and Inflexible dealt with the 2 German armoured cruisers. In the main battle formation, Invincible and Inflexible turned 7 points to port into line ahead on the beam of von Spee's 2 armoured cruisers, the British ships opening fire, Invincible on Gneisenau and Inflexible on Scharnhorst, at a range of 14,000 yards or 8 miles, which was 1,000 yards beyond the range of the German guns, thus meaning these 2 vessels could not equally engage the British on even terms. Von Spee, in response, altering his course towards his enemy and bringing the range to 13,000 yards or 7.5 miles, the 2 German ships firing upon their British adversaries, and even at the very extent of their range, were able to land the first shots on the Invincible, Sterde responding by altering his own course to bring his ships out of range of the Germans, with both combatants now running on parallel courses, each side having distinct disadvantages that led to neither one being able to hit each other during this early stage of the battle, von Spee being forced to show restraint with his shots, as due to the exhaustion of his ammunition supplies at the Battle of Coronel, he had a limited number of shells with which to fight off the British, while the British battle cruisers were severely hampered by their own smoke, the after turrets on Invincible and all the guns on Inflexible being masked by the dense black clouds, ultimately leading to a temporary stalemate as both ships fell out of range at 16,000 yards and thus ceased firing. At 2:05 p.m, Sterde chose to close the range again by turning 8 points to starboard, but the ever-present problem of thick exhaust smoke meant he lost sight of the 2 German armoured cruisers, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, taking this opportunity to turn 10 points to starboard and retreat south in pursuit of the German light cruisers, and with their range now sitting at 17,000 yards or 9.65 miles, the British battle cruisers increased to flank speed so as to chase down the enemy, closing the distance to 15,000 yards or 8.5 miles by 2:45 p.m, and thus allowing for Sterde to bring his broadside into play, the British opening fire, followed 5 minutes later by von Spee turning 9 points to port into line ahead, the British Admiral responding with a 6-point turn to port, and thus bringing the ships broadside to broadside, allowing the Germans to return fire, the 2 lines now on a converging course with a range closing, and thus giving the impression that von Spee wanted to bring his secondary armament into action, which comprised 6-inch guns on the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, while the secondary armament on Invincible and Inflexible comprised 4-inch guns, the range dropping to 12,500 yards or 7 miles by 3 p.m, and thus von Spee ordered his ships to open fire with their 6-inch guns. The battle raged on for the next 15 minutes, with both sides scoring hits on each other in a display of manpower that was completely one-sided, the British having little damage inflicted on their heavily armoured structures, while the lighter German ships took severe punishment, Scharnhorst, having lost one of her funnels, struggling to maintain fire due to depleted ammunition and was also on fire, while Gneisenau was beginning to list. Sterde, in order to clear the thick smoke that was hampering his ability to achieve a clean kill, turning his line nearly back on itself through 18 points at 3:15 p.m, putting him windward and thus free of the smoke cloud, allowing the British battle cruisers to rain fire on the Germans with impunity, followed 5 minutes later by the British ships moving in across the Germans' wake so as to lay down suppressive fire on the armoured cruisers, Gneisenau's list being such that her secondary armament was forced to cease fire, while Scharnhorst continued to take serious damage. This situation continuing until 3:30 p.m, when von Spee ordered a turn of 16 points to starboard so as to head northwest and cross the bows of the British, allowing Scharnhorst to bring her unengaged broadside into action. At a range of 12,000 yards or 6.8 miles, von Spee was forced to turn away under the heavy fire, while Sterde also turned and quickly moved out of range of the German secondary armament, allowing Inflexible, for the first time in the engagement, the ability to fight unhindered by the exhaust smoke of the British flagship, directing her fire on the Scharnhorst alongside Invincible, the ravaged German armoured cruiser being pummeled until 4 p.m, when the ship suddenly ceased firing and lurched to starboard, Inflexible breaking off to chase down the Gneisenau, while Invincible remained with the Scharnhorst during her death throes, von Spee, aboard the rapidly sinking flagship, transmitting his final order for the Gneisenau to try and save herself before the Scharnhorst finally keeled over and sank at 4:17 p.m. with the death of all hands, Invincible unable to mount a rescue for the survivors in the water due to the ongoing action with the fleeing Gneisenau. Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, together with 840 men and officers, all being lost to the unforgiving South Atlantic. Gneisenau soldiered on alone at a range of 11,000 yards or 6.25 miles, being engaged by both battle cruisers at close quarters and thus taking another severe pounding, joined shortly thereafter by HMS Carnarvon, which could catch up easily due to the slow speed of the failing German warship. The three ships concentrating fire on the Gneisenau, even as weather conditions began to deteriorate towards 5 p.m., visibility falling, but the German armoured cruiser still in range of the pursuing British. The situation by 5:30 p.m. being that the vessel had lost a funnel, her speed had dropped to 8 knots, her fore was fully ablaze, and she had run out of 8-inch ammunition. The Gneisenau, now listing heavily, turning to face the enemy and continuing to fire sporadically for the next 15 minutes before suddenly stopping. This last show of defiance being to allow the captain to open the seacocks and scuttle the vessel to avoid capture. The British ships closing to 3,500 yards or 2 miles before the rapidly sinking Gneisenau capsized, her crew last being seen walking upon her exposed keel before the ship slipped beneath the waves, the British lowering boats and eventually being able to rescue 125 German sailors from the water, while the remaining 598 went to the bottom with their ship. As for the light cruisers, Dresden, Nuremberg and Leipzig, their British pursuers, Glasgow, Kent and Cornwall, had broken off from Inflexible and Invincible in order to chase them down and destroy them, the German vessels, as per their original design, being capable of escaping the British in terms of full speed, but had been at sea constantly since June 1914 without either a full refit or maintenance. The main base for the East Asiatic Squadron at Tsingtao on China's Yellow Sea coast, Germany's only naval base in the Pacific, having fallen in August of that year to an Anglo-Japanese strike force, and thus meant the German crews had not the facilities to maintain the efficiency of their ships, compounded further by their involvement in a major battle against the British at Coronel that, while victorious, had robbed these cruisers of their ammunition, though what weapons the German light cruisers had, which comprised a selection of 4.1-inch guns, were no match against the 6-inch guns aboard the armoured cruisers Kent and Cornwall. Immediately following the beginning of the pursuit, the German light cruisers remained in tight formation, while Glasgow, the fastest of both fleets, moved to close its range to 12,000 yards or 6.8 miles from the Leipzig, opening fire at around 2 p.m., Leipzig turning starboard to engage the Glasgow with a full broadside, causing the British vessel to withdraw out of range, with the chase resuming. This process repeating between the Glasgow and the Leipzig as a means of closing the gap between these two vessels and the more powerful Kent and Cornwall coming up behind. This situation continuing until 3:30 p.m. when the German light cruisers scattered, Nuremberg turning away to port and Dresden disappearing to the southwest. Kent and Cornwall agreeing between them that the Kent should take on the Nuremberg, while Cornwall, as assisted by Glasgow, dealt with the Leipzig, the two pursuing British ships, by 4:45 p.m., being able to straddle the German with heavy gunfire that led to severe damage to her structure and the death of her gunnery lieutenant, a severe handicap to the effective control of her firing. At 5 p.m., Cornwall turned sharply to starboard and riddled the Leipzig with her broadside, the German cruiser now barely moving and responding to fire inconsistently. The start of rainfall at around 6 p.m., demanding the two British ships finish the job as quickly as possible, with both vessels moving to within 8,000 yards or 4.5 miles of their target. A salvo from Cornwall setting the Leipzig ablaze, with intermittent fire from the German ship continuing until around 7 p.m., when she finally ran out of ammunition and her guns fell silent. The 4-hour battle coming to a brief conclusion as the British waited to see whether she would surrender, the German captain ordering the opening of the seacocks and the scuttling of his ship, though with the German battle ensigns still flying, the British took this as the Leipzig having not surrendered, and at 7:30 p.m. began to riddle the light cruiser with more heavy fire, as 150 of her surviving crew huddled for safety amidships away from the infernos fore and aft, putting them directly in line with the British assault and seeing dozens of them killed, the Germans ultimately surrendering when they displayed 2 green flares. Lowering boats, Cornwall and Glasgow rushed to the rescue of the survivors as they jumped into the churning South Atlantic, though while many had escaped the sinking vessel, the frigid waters and slow progress in plucking the Germans from the ocean meant most would succumb to the freezing temperatures before help reached them, meaning ultimately that, of the 294 men and officers aboard the ship, only 5 officers and 13 seamen were pulled alive from the water, while the Leipzig itself would continue to burn until 9:23 p.m. when it finally rolled over and sank. British casualties by comparison including 18 hits on the Cornwall that left her listing to port, but with no deaths or injuries reported, while the Glasgow had been hit twice, with 1 man killed and 4 wounded. Back with the SMS Nuremberg, following the order to scramble at 4:30 p.m, the ship continued to be pursued by HMS Kent at a range of 7 miles, the chase being initially even, with both ships achieving 22 knots, before the immense strain on Nuremberg's under-maintained boilers caused 2 of them to burst, reducing her speed to 19 knots. Kent, having had no opportunity to take on coal at Port Stanley, being very low on fuel, and thus her commanding officer, Captain John Derwent Allen, ordered all wood aboard the ship, including the ornate darkwood furniture in the officers' quarters, to be taken to the engine room and loaded into the burners, pushing the ship's speed to 25 knots and closing the distance to 12,000 yards or 6.8 miles by 5 p.m. Nuremberg opening fire on Kent with her rear 4.1-inch guns, but only achieved 1 hit, while the range on Kent's forward 6-inch guns was too far to present a possible target, the gap closing by 5:30 p.m. and thus forcing Nuremberg, 15 minutes later, to turn 8 points to port so as to bring around her broadside, though Captain Allen was not interested in a long-range duel, instead opting to get as close as he could and finish the German light cruiser off at close range, reducing the distance to a mere 6,000 yards or 3.5 miles. By 6 p.m, Kent was only 3,000 yards or 1.7 miles from the Nuremberg, and with her superior 6-inch guns, laid a volley of devastating hits onto the German cruiser, the Nuremberg attempting to widen the distance and get out of Kent's range, but was still being fired upon by highly accurate shots from her British adversary, leaving the ship, by 6:10 p.m, on fire and losing speeds with only 2 guns operational, Kent overtaking and cutting across her bows so as to rake her with starboard batteries, this being achieved at only 3,500 yards or 1.9 miles, and thus resulted in an oppressive strafe of 6-inch shells that destroyed Nuremberg's forward turret. The situation, by 6:25 p.m, being that Nuremberg was dead in the water and no longer firing, while also listing heavily and down at the stern, the entire ship being ablaze with no sign of any crew, as Kent moved to within 3,300 yards or 1.8 miles of the sinking cruiser. The continued flying of the German battle ensign, seeing Kent resume firing for another 5 minutes, until one of the survivors hauled it down. Damage to the Kent's boats, meaning no rescue of the German crew could be mounted, by the time the Nuremberg turned over to starboard and sank at 7:30 p.m. A search for survivors continuing until 9 p.m, with only 7 members of the ship's 322 men and officers being plucked alive from the water, while Kent had been hit 40 times during the skirmish, killing 4 and injuring 12. Elsewhere, HMS Bristol, having been informed of the German support ships passing the Falklands, set out in hot pursuit and, in the company of HMS Macedonia, chased down the 2 colliers and the hospital ship by way of their smoke, the hospital ship, Seydlitz, breaking off from the main group and escaping alone, while the colliers Baden and Santa Isabel drew their British pursuers away until 3:30 p.m, at which point Bristol and Macedonia overtook the 2 Germans and ordered them to stop. The vessels, while carrying a huge amount of valuable coal, being ordered sunk so as to deprive the East Asiatic squadron of supplies in the event they had won the engagement against the British fleet and intended to mount a base in the Falklands, Bristol and Macedonia unaware that the Royal Navy had achieved an overwhelming victory, and thus meant that the captured coal would have served a useful purpose in restocking the depleted supplies at Port Stanley, the crew of the 2 colliers being taken prisoner, followed, at 7 p.m, by the Baden and the Santa Isabel being scuttled. Thus, the Battle of the Falkland Islands had concluded with a decisive victory for the Royal Navy, having only suffered 10 killed and 19 wounded, when compared to the German losses of 2,029 killed, 215 captured, 2 armoured cruisers sunk, 2 light cruisers sunk, and 2 transports scuttled, this vicious confrontation costing the Imperial German Navy its East Asiatic squadron, together with its flagship of the Pacific and one of its most experienced serving officers. Although despite the British successfully routing their enemies on that day, the fight was still far from over, as the SMS Dresden was able to make good its escape and retreat back towards the Pacific, leading the Royal Navy on a desperate search of the vast ocean waves to intercept and destroy this elusive intruder.